So, for my stream, I'm planning on reading through a book for the viewers, people who are watching. This book is a Victorian era novel written in 1860 called The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Now, Wilkie Collins is the book itself was very successful. It's still quite well thought of, and Wilkie Collins as an author is as well, but he tends to be very overshadowed by other novelists of the period, especially in the U.S. Normally in school you would read more Dickens, who was his friend and contemporary. Otherwise, the Brontes, or in France you would have Victor Hugo and Dumas, or the Russians like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, or in America it would have been Herman Melville or Nathaniel Hawthorne, since they were all writing within about 15 to 20 years, right around when this book was released. If anyone teaches this book at all, it tends to be a little bit less well known because it's just not quite as important and famous. Wilkie Collins himself was very much a typical middle-class kind of Victorian man. He definitely was not a starving artist. He just had a famous painter for a father, so he had a fairly normal life for that era. And then the only thing particularly bohemian or unusual about him was the fact that he, of course, had a terrible opium addiction, which was also very common at the time. And then he didn't believe in marriage. So he had a relationship that nowadays we would probably call polyamorous. He spent 20 years living between two different women, each in their own house, and he would just sort of go back and forth, which even now is still a little bit unusual, but he never married either of them. So that's sort of basic background of the author in the book. So I think we're ready to get started. The Woman in White. The story begun by Walter Arkwright of Clements Inn, teacher of drawing. This is the story of what a woman's patience can endure and what a man's resolution can achieve. If the machinery of the law could be depended on to fathom every case of suspicion and to conduct every process of inquiry, with moderate assistance only from the lubricating influences of oil of gold, the events which fill these pages might have claimed their share of public attention in the court of justice. But the law is still, in certain inevitable cases, the pre-engaged servant of the long purse, and the story is left to be told for the first time in this place. As the judge might once have heard it, so the reader shall hear it now. No circumstance of importance, from the beginning to the end of the disclosure, shall be related on a hearsay evidence. When the writer of these introductory lines, Walter Arkwright by name, happens to be more closely connected than others with the incidents to be recorded, he will describe them in his own person. When his experience fails, he will retire from the position of narrator, and his task will be continued from the point at which he has left it off by other persons who can speak to the circumstances under notice from their own knowledge, just as clearly and positively as he has spoken before them. Thus the story here presented will be told by more than one pen, as the story of an offense against the law is told in court by more than one witness, with the same object, in both cases, to present the truth, always in its most direct and most intelligible aspect, and to trace the course of one complete series of events by making two persons who have been most closely connected with them, at each successive stage, relate their own experience, word for word. Let Walter Hartright, teacher of drawing, aged 28 years, be heard first. It was the last day of July. The long, hot summer was drawing to a close, and we, the weary pilgrims of the London pavement, were beginning to think of the cloud shadows on the cornfields and the autumn breezes on the seashore. For my own poor part, the fading summer left me out of health, out of spirits, and if the truth must be told, out of money as well. During the past year, I had not managed my professional resources as carefully as usual, and my extravagance now limited me to the prospect of spending the autumn economically between my mother's cottage in Hampstead and my own chambers in town. The evening, I remember, was still and cloudy. The London air was at its heaviest. The distant hum of the street traffic was at its faintest. The small pulse of the life within me and the great heart of the city around me seemed to be sinking in unison, languidly and more languidly with the sinking sun. I roused myself from the book which I was dreaming over rather than reading, and left my chambers to meet the cool night air in the suburbs. It was one of 2 evenings in every week which I was accustomed to spend with my mother and my sister. So I turned my steps northward in the direction of Hampstead. Events which I have yet to relate make it necessary to mention in this place that my father has been dead some years at the period of which I am now writing, and that my sister Sarah and I were the sole survivors of a family of 5 children. My father was a drawing master before me. His exertions had made him highly successful in his profession, and his affectionate anxiety to provide for the future of those who were dependent on his labors had impelled him from the time of his marriage to devote to the ensuring of his life as a much larger portion of his income than most men consider it necessary to set aside for that purpose. Thanks to his admirable prudence and self-denial, my mother and sister were left after his death as independent of the world as they had been during his lifetime. I succeeded to his connection and had every reason to feel grateful for the prospect that awaited me at my starting in life. The quiet twilight was still trembling on the topmost ridges of the heath, and the view of London below me had sunk into a black gulf in the shadow of the cloudy night. When I stood before the gate of my mother's cottage, I had hardly rung the bell before the house door was opened violently. My worthy Italian friend, Professor Pesca, appeared in the servant's place, and darted out joyously to receive me with a shrill foreign parody on an English cheer. On his own account, and I must be allowed to add on mine also, the professor merits the honor of a formal introduction. Accident has made him the starting point of the strange family story which it is the purpose of these pages to unfold. I had first become acquainted with my Italian friend by meeting him at certain great houses where he taught his own language and I taught drawing. All I then knew of the history of his life was that he had once held a position in the University of Padua, that he had left Italy for political reasons, the nature of which he uniformly declined to mention to anyone, and that he had been for many years respectably established in London as a teacher of languages. Without being actually a dwarf, for he was perfectly well proportioned from head to foot, Pesca was, I think, the smallest human being I ever saw out of a showroom. Remarkable anywhere by his personal appearance, he was still further distinguished among the rank and file of mankind by the harmless eccentricity of his character. The ruling idea of his life appeared to be that he was bound to show his gratitude to the country which had afforded him an asylum and a means of subsistence by doing his utmost to turn himself into an Englishman. Not content with paying the nation in general the compliment of invariably carrying an umbrella and invariably wearing gaiters and a white hat, the professor further aspired to become an Englishman in his habits and amusements, as well as in his personal appearance. Finding us distinguished as a nation by our love of athletic exercises, the little man, in the innocence of his heart, devoted himself impromptu to all our English sports and pastimes, whenever he had the opportunity of joining them. Firmly persuaded that he could adopt our national amusements of the field by any effort of will, precisely as he had adopted our national gaiters and our national white hat. I had seen him risk his limbs blindly at a fox hunt and in a cricket field, and soon afterwards I saw him risk his life just as blindly in the sea at Brighton. We had met there accidentally and were bathing together. If we had been engaged in any exercise peculiar to my own nation, I should, of course, have looked after Pesca carefully, but as foreigners are generally quite as well able to take care of themselves in the water as Englishmen, it never occurred to me that the art of swimming might merely add one more to the list of manly exercises which the professor believed that he could learn impromptu. Soon after we had both struck out from the shore, I stopped, finding my friend did not gain on me, and turned round to look for him. To my horror and amazement, I saw nothing between me and the beach but two little white arms, which struggled for an instant above the surface of the water and then disappeared from view. When I dived for him, the poor little man was lying quietly coiled up at the bottom in a hollow of shingle, looking by many degrees smaller than I had ever seen him look before. During the few minutes that elapsed, while I was taking him in, the air revived him, and he ascended the steps of the machine with my assistance. With the partial recovery of his animation came the return of his wonderful delusion on the subject of swimming. As soon as his chattering teeth would let him speak, he smiled vacantly and said he thought it must have been a cramp. When he had thoroughly recovered himself and had joined me on the beach, his warm southern nature broke through all artificial English restraints in a moment. He overwhelmed me with the wildest expressions of affection, exclaimed passionately in his exaggerated Italian way that he would hold his life henceforth at my disposal, and declared that he should never be happy again until he had found an opportunity of proving his gratitude by rendering me some service which I might remember on my side to the end of my days. I did my best to stop the torrent of his tears and protestations by persisting in treating the whole adventure as a good subject for a joke, and succeeded at last, as I imagined, in lessening Pesca's overwhelming sense of obligation to me. Little did I think then, little did I think afterwards, when our pleasant holiday had drawn to an end, that the opportunity of serving me, for which my grateful companion so ardently longed, was soon to come, that he was eagerly to seize it on the instant, and that, by so doing, he was to turn the whole current of my existence into a new channel, and to alter me to myself almost past recognition. Yet so it was. If I had not dived for Professor Pesca when he lay under water on his shingle bed, I should, in all human probability, never have been connected with the story which these pages will relate. I should never, perhaps, have heard even the name of the woman who has lived in all my thoughts, who has possessed herself of all my energies, who's become the one guiding influence that now directs the purpose of my life. Pesca's face and manner, on the evening when we confronted each other at my mother's gate, were more than sufficient to inform me that something extraordinary had happened. It was quite useless, however, to ask him for an immediate explanation. I could only conjecture, while he was dragging me in by both hands, that, knowing my habits, he had come to the cottage to make sure of meeting me that night, and that he had some news to tell of an unusually agreeable kind. We both bounced into the parlor in a highly abrupt and undignified manner. My mother sat by the open window, laughing and fanning herself. Pesca was one of her especial favorites, and his wildest eccentricities were always pardonable in her eyes. Poor dear soul! From the moment when she found out that the little professor was deeply and gratefully attached to her son, she opened her heart to him unreservedly and took all his puzzling foreign peculiarities for granted without so much as attempting to understand any one of them. My sister Sarah, with all the advantages of youth, was strangely enough less pliable. She did full justice to Pesca's excellent qualities of heart, but she could not accept him implicitly as my mother accepted him for my sake. Her insular notions of propriety rose in perpetual revolt against Pesca's constitutional contempt for appearances, and she was always more or less undisguisedly astonished at my mother's familiarity with the eccentric little foreigner. I have observed, not only in my sister's case, but in the instances of others, that we of the young generation are nothing like so hardy and so impulsive as some of our elders. I constantly see old people flushed and excited by the prospect of some anticipated pleasure, which altogether fails to ruffle the tranquillity of their serene grandchildren. Are we, I wonder, quite such genuine boys and girls now as our seniors were in their time? Has the great advance in education taken rather too long a stride? And are we, in these modern days, just the least trifle in the world too well brought up? Without attempting to answer those questions decisively, I may at least record that I never saw my mother and my sister together in Pesca's society without finding my mother much the younger woman of the two. On this occasion, for example, while the old lady was laughing heartily over the boyish manner in which we tumbled into the parlor, Sarah was perturbedly picking up the broken pieces of a teacup, which the professor had knocked off the table in his precipitate advance to make me at the door. "I don't know what would have happened, Walter," said my mother, "if you had delayed much longer. Pesca has been half mad with impatience, and I have been half mad with curiosity. The professor has brought some wonderful news with him, in which he says you are concerned, and he has cruelly refused to give us the smallest hint of it until his friend Walter appeared." "Very provoking. It spoils the set," murmured Sarah to herself, mournfully absorbed over the ruins of the broken cup. While these words were being spoken, Pesca, happily and fussily unconscious of the irreparable wrong which the crockery had suffered at his hands, was dragging a large armchair to the opposite end of the room, so as to command us all three, in the character of a public speaker addressing an audience. Having turned the chair with its back towards us, he jumped into it on its knees and excitably addressed his small congregation of three from an impromptu pulpit. "Now, my good dears," began Pesca, who always said good dears when he meant worthy friends, "listen to me. The time has come. I recite my good news, and I speak at last." "Hear, hear," said my mother, humoring the joke. "The next thing he will break, Mamma," whispered Sarah, "will be the back of the best armchair." "I go back into my life, and I address myself to the noblest of created beings," continued Pesca, vehemently apostrophizing my unworthy self over the top rail of the chair, "who found me dead at the bottom of the sea through cramp, and who pulled me up to the top. And what did I say when I got into my own life and my own clothes again?" "Much more than was necessary," I answered, as doggedly as possible, for the least encouragement in connection with this subject invariably let loose the professor's emotions in a flood of tears. "I said," persisted Pesca, "that my life belonged to my dear friend Walter for the rest of my days, and so it does. I said that I should never be happy again until I found the opportunity of doing a good something for Walter, and I have never been contented with myself till this most blessed day. Now," cried the enthusiastic little man at the top of his voice, "the overflowing happiness bursts out of me at every pore of my skin, like perspiration, for on my faith and soul and honor, the something is done at last, and the only word to say now is, right, all right." It may be necessary to explain here that Pesca prided himself on being a perfect Englishman in his language, as well as in his dress, manners, and amusements. Having picked up a few of our most familiar colloquial expressions, he scattered them about over his conversation whenever they happened to occur to him, turning them, in his high relish for their sound and his general ignorance of their sense, into compound words and repetitions of his own, and always running them into each other as if they consisted of one long syllable. "Among the fine London houses where I teach the language of my native country," said the professor, rushing into his long-deferred explanation without another word of preface, "there is one mighty fine in the big place called Portland. You all know where that is. Yes, of course. The fine house, my good dears, has got inside it a fine family. A mamma, fair and fat, 3 young misses, fair and fat, and the 2 young misters, fair and fat, and a papa, the fairest and fattest of all, who is a mighty merchant, up to his eyes in gold. A fine man once, but seeing that he has got a naked head and 2 chins, fine no longer at the present time. Now mind, I teach the sublime Dante to the young misses, and my soul, bless my soul, it is not in human language to say how the sublime Dante puzzles the pretty heads of all 3. No matter, all in good time, and the more lessons the better for me. Now mind, imagine yourself that I am teaching the young misses today as usual. We are all 4 of us down together in the hell of Dante at the 7th circle. But no matter for that, all the circles are alike to the 3 young misses, fair and fat. At the 7th circle, nevertheless, my pupils are sticking fast, and I, to set them going again, recite, explain, and blow myself up red hot with useless enthusiasm when a creak of boots in the passage outside, and in comes the golden papa, the mighty merchant with the naked head and the 2 chins. Ha, my good dears, I am closer than you think to the business now. Have you been patient so far, or have you said to yourself, "Deuce, what the deuce, Pasca is long-winded tonight"? We declared that we were deeply interested. The professor went on. In his hand, the golden papa has a letter, and after he has made his excuse for the disturbing us in our infernal region with the common mortal business of the house, he addresses himself to 3 young misses and begins, as you English begin everything in this blessed world that you have to say, with a great O. "Oh, my dears," says the mighty merchant, "I have got here a letter from my friend, Mr. The name has slipped out of my mind, but no matter, we shall come back to that. Yes. Right, all right. So the papa says, I have got a letter from my friend, the mister, and he wants a recommend from me of a drawing master, to go down into his house in the country. My soul, bless my soul, when I heard the golden papa say those words, if I had been big enough to reach up to him, I should have put my arms round his neck and pressed him to my bosom in a long and grateful hug. As it was, I only bounced upon my chair. My seat was on thorns, and my soul was on fire to speak. But I held my tongue and let Papa go on. "Perhaps you know," says this good man of money, twiddling his friend's letter this way and that, in his golden fingers and thumbs, "perhaps you know, my dears, of a drawing master that I can recommend?" The 3 young misses all look at each other and then say, with the indispensable great O to begin, "Oh, dear, no, Papa. But here's Mr. Pesca." At the mention of myself, I can hold no longer. The thought of you, my good dears, mounts like blood to my head. I start from my seat as if a spike had grown up from the ground through the bottom of my chair. I address myself to the mighty merchant, and I say, English phrase, "Dear sir, I have the man, the first and foremost drawing master of the world. Recommend him by the post tonight, and send him off, bag and baggage." English phrase again, huh? "Send him off, bag and baggage, by the train tomorrow." Stop, says Papa. Is he a foreigner or an Englishman? "English to the bone of his back," I answer. "Respectable?" says Papa. Sir, I say, for this last question of his outrages me, and I have done being familiar with him. Sir, the immortal fire of genius burns in this Englishman's bosom, and what is more, his father had it before him. Never mind, says the golden barbarian of a Papa. Never mind about his genius, Mr. Pesca. We don't want genius in this country, unless it is accompanied by respectability. And then we are very glad to have it, very glad indeed. Can your friend produce testimonials? Letters that speak to his character? I wave my hand negligently. Letters, I say. Ha, my soul, bless my soul, I should think so indeed. Volumes of letters and portfolios of testimonials, if you'd like. 1 or 2 will do, says this man of phlegm and money. Let him send them to me with his name and address, and stop, Mr. Pesca. Before you go to your friend, you had better take a note. Bank note, I say indignantly. No bank note, if you please, till my brave Englishman has earned it first. Bank note, says Papa, in great surprise. Who talked of bank note? I mean a note of the terms, a memorandum of what he is expected to do. Go on with your lesson, Mr. Pesca, and I will give you the necessary extract from my friend's letter. Down sits the man of merchandise and money to his pen, ink, and paper, and down I go once again into the hell of Dante, with my 3 young misses after me. In 10 minutes' time, the note is written, and the boots of Papa are creaking themselves away in the passage outside. From that moment, on my faith and soul and honor, I know nothing more. The glorious thought that I have caught my opportunity at last, and that my grateful service for my dearest friend in the world is as good as done already, flies up into my head and makes me drunk. How I pull my young misses and myself out of our infernal region again, how my other business is done afterwards, how my little bit of dinner slides itself down my throat, I know no more than a man in the moon. Enough for me that here I am with the mighty merchant's note in my hand, as large as life, as hot as fire, and as happy as a king. Right, all right. Here the professor waved the memorandum of terms over his head and ended his long and voluble narrative with his shrill Italian parody on an English cheer. My mother rose the moment he had done, with flushed cheeks and brightened eyes. She caught the little man warmly by both hands. My dear good Pesca, she said, I never doubted your true affection for Walter, but I am more than ever persuaded of it now. I'm sure we are very much obliged to Professor Pesca for Walter's sake, added Sarah. She half rose while she spoke, as if to approach the armchair in her turn, but observing that Pesca was rapturously kissing my mother's hands, looked serious and resumed her seat. If the familiar little man treats my mother that way, how will he treat me? Faces sometimes tell the truth, and that was unquestionably the thought in Sarah's mind as she sat down again. Though I myself was gratefully sensible of the kindness of Pesca's motives, my spirits were hardly so much elevated as they ought to have been by the prospect of future employment now placed before me. When the professor had quite done with my mother's hand, and when I had warmly thanked him for his interference on my behalf, I asked to be allowed to look at the note of terms, which his respectable patron had drawn up for my inspection. Pesca handed me the paper with a triumphant flourish of the hand. Read, said the little man majestically. I promise you, my friend, the writing of the Golden Papa speaks with a tongue of trumpets for itself. The note of terms was plain, straightforward, and comprehensive, at any rate. It informed me, first, that Frederick Fairley, Esquire, of Limmeridge House, Cumberland, wanted to engage the services of a thoroughly competent drawing master for a period of 4 months certain. Secondly, that the duties which the master was expected to perform would be of a twofold kind. He was to superintend the instruction of 2 young ladies in the art of painting in watercolors, and he was to devote his leisure time afterwards to the business of repairing and mounting a valuable collection of drawings which had been suffered to fall into a condition of total neglect. Thirdly, that the terms offered to the person who should undertake and properly perform these duties were 4 guineas a week, that he was to reside at Limmeridge House, and that he was to be treated there on the footing of a gentleman. Fourthly, and lastly, that no person need think of applying for this situation unless he could furnish the most unexceptionable references to character and abilities. The references were to be sent to Mr. Fairley's friend in London, who was empowered to conclude all necessary arrangements. These instructions were followed by the name and address of Pesca's employer in Portland Place, and there the note or memorandum ended. The prospect which this offer of an engagement held out was certainly an attractive one. The employment was likely to be both easy and agreeable. It was proposed to me at the autumn time of the year when I was least occupied, and the terms, judging by my personal experience in the profession, were surprisingly liberal. I knew this. I knew that I ought to consider myself very fortunate if I succeeded in securing the offered employment, and yet, no sooner had I read the memorandum than I felt an inexplicable unwillingness within me to stir in the matter. I had never in the whole of my previous experience found my duty and my inclination so painfully and unaccountably at variance as I found them now. "Oh, Walter, your father never had a chance such as this," said my mother, when she read the note of terms and had handed it back to me. "Such distinguished people to know," remarked Sarah, straightening herself in her chair, "and on such gratifying terms of equality, too." Yes, the terms in every sense are tempting enough," I replied impatiently, "but before I send in my testimonials, I should like a little time to consider." "Consider?" exclaimed my mother. "Why, Walter, what is the matter with you?" "Consider," echoed my sister. "What a very extraordinary thing to say under the circumstances." "Consider," chimed in the professor. "What is there to consider about? Answer me this. Have you not been complaining of your health? And have you not been longing for what you call a smack of the country breeze? Well, there in your hand is the paper that offers your perpetual choking mouthfuls of country breeze for 4 months' time. Is it not so? Again, you want money. Well, it is 4 golden guineas a week nothing? My soul, bless my soul, only give it to me, and my boots shall creak like the golden papas, with a sense of the overpowering richness of the man who walks in them. 4 guineas a week, and more than that, the charming society of 2 young misses, and more than that, your bed, your breakfast, your dinner, your gorging English teas and lunches, and drinks of foaming beer, all for nothing. Walter, my dear good friend, deuce, what the deuce! For the first time in my life, I have not eyes enough in my head to look and wonder at you." Neither my mother's evident astonishment at my behavior, nor Pesca's fervid enumeration of the advantages offered to me by the new employment, had any effect in shaking my unreasonable disinclination to go to Limmeridge House. After starting all the petty obligations that I could think of to going to Cumberland, and after hearing them answered, one after another, to my own complete discomfiture, I tried to set up a last obstacle by asking what was to become of my pupils in London while I was teaching Mr. Fairley's young ladies to sketch from nature. The obvious answer to this was that the great part of them would be away on their autumn travels, and that the few who remained at home might be confided to the care of one of my brother drawing masters, whose pupils I had once taken off his hands under similar circumstances. My sister reminded me that this gentleman had expressly placed his services at my disposal during the present season, in case I wished to leave town. My mother seriously appealed to me not to let an idle caprice stand in the way of my own interest and my own health. and Pesca piteously entreated me that I would not wound him to the heart by rejecting the first grateful offer of service that he had been able to make to the friend who had saved his life. The evident sincerity and affection which inspired these remonstrances would have influenced any man with an atom of good feeling in his composition. Though I could not conquer my own unaccountable perversity, I had at least virtue enough to be heartily ashamed of it, and to end the discussion pleasantly by giving way and promising to do all that was wanted of me. The rest of the evening passed merrily enough in humorous anticipations of my coming life with 2 young ladies in Cumberland. Pesca, inspired by our natural grog, which appeared to get into his head in the most marvelous manner 5 minutes after it had gone down his throat, asserted his claims to be considered a complete Englishman by making a series of speeches in rapid succession, proposing my mother's health, my sister's health, my health, and the healths en masse of Mr. Fairley and the 2 young misses, pathetically returning thanks himself immediately after for the whole party. "A secret, Walter," said my little friend confidently as we walked home together. "I am flushed by the recollection of my own eloquence. My soul bursts itself with ambition. One of these days I go into your noble parliament. It is the dream of my whole life to be Honorable Pesca, M.P." The next morning I sent my testimonials to the professor's employer in Portland Place. 3 days passed, and I concluded with secret satisfaction that my papers had not been found sufficiently explicit. On the 4th day, however, an answer came. It announced that Mr. Fairley accepted my services and requested me to start for Cumberland immediately. All the necessary instructions for my journey were carefully and clearly added in a postscript. I made my arrangements, unwillingly enough, for leaving London early the next day. Towards evening, Pesca looked in, on his way to a dinner party, to bid me goodbye. "I shall dry my tears in your absence," said the professor gaily, "with this glorious thought. It is my auspicious hand that has given the first push to your fortune in the world. Go, my friend, when your sun shines in Cumberland," English proverb, "in the name of heaven, make your hay, marry one of the 2 young misses, become Honorable Hartright, M.P., and when you are on top of the ladder, remember that Pesca at the bottom has done it all." I tried to laugh with my little friend over his parting jest, but my spirits were not to be commanded. Something jarred in me, almost painfully, while he was speaking his light farewell words. When I was left alone again, nothing remained to be done but to walk to the Hampstead cottage and bid my mother and Sarah goodbye. So I'm going to take a quick break and have a drink. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Onward. The heat had been painfully oppressive all day, and it was now a close and sultry night. My mother and sister had spoken so many last words and had begged me to wait another 5 minutes, so many times that it was nearly midnight when the servant locked the garden gate behind me. I walked forward with a few paces on the shortest way back to London, then stopped and hesitated. The moon was full and broad in the dark blue starless sky, and the broken ground of the heath looked wild enough in the mysterious light to be hundreds of miles away from the great city that lay beneath it. The idea of descending any sooner than I could help into the heat and gloom of London repelled me. The prospect of going to bed in my airless chambers, the prospect of gradual suffocation, seemed, in my present restless frame of mind and body, to be one and the same thing. I determined to stroll home in the purer air by the most roundabout way I could take, to follow the white, winding paths across the lonely heath, and to approach London through its most open suburb by striking into the Finchley Road, and so getting back in the cool of the new morning by the western side of Regent's Park. I wound my way down slowly over the heath, enjoying the divine stillness of the scene, and admiring the soft alterations of light and shade as they followed each other over the broken ground on every side of me. So long as I was proceeding through this first and prettiest part of my night walk, my mind remained passively open to the impressions produced by the view, and I thought but little on any subject. Indeed, so far as my own sensations were concerned, I can hardly say that I thought at all. But when I had left the heath and had turned into the by-road where there was less to see, the ideas naturally engendered by the approaching change in my habits and occupations gradually grew more and more of my attention exclusively to themselves. By the time I had arrived at the end of the road, I had become completely absorbed in my own fanciful visions of Limmeridge House, of Mr. Fairley, and of the two ladies whose practice in the art of watercolor painting I was so soon to superintend. I had now arrived at that particular point of my walk where 4 roads meet: the road to Hampstead, along which I had returned, the road to Finchley, the road to West End, and the road back to London. I had mechanically turned in this latter direction and was strolling along the lonely high road, idly wondering, I remember, what the Cumberland young ladies would look like, when, in one moment, every drop of blood in my body was brought to a stop by the touch of a hand laid lightly and suddenly on my shoulder from behind me. I turned on the instant, with my fingers tightening round the handle of my stick. There, in the middle of the broad, bright high road, there, as if it had that moment sprung out of the earth or dropped from the heaven, stood the figure of a solitary woman, dressed from head to foot in white garments, her face bent in grave inquiry on mine, her hand pointing to the dark cloud over London as I faced her. I was far too seriously startled by the suddenness with which this extraordinary apparition stood before me, in the dead of night and in that lonely place, to ask what she wanted. The strange woman spoke first. "Is that the road to London?" she said. I looked attentively at her as she put that singular question to me. It was then nearly 1 o'clock. All I could discern distinctly by the moonlight was a colorless, useful face, meager and sharp to look at, about the cheeks and chin, large, grave, wistfully attentive eyes, nervous, uncertain lips, and light hair of a pale, brownish-yellow hue. There was nothing wild, nothing immodest in her nature. It was quiet and self-controlled, a little melancholy, and a little touched by suspicion. Not exactly the manner of a lady, and, at the same time, not the manner of a woman in the humblest rank of life. The voice, little as I had yet heard of it, had something curiously still and mechanical in its tones, and the utterance was remarkably rapid. She held a small bag in her hand, and her dress, bonnet, shawl, and gown, all of white, was, so far as I could guess, certainly not composed of very delicate or very expensive materials. Her figure was slight, and rather above the average height, her gait and actions free from the slightest approach to extravagance. This was all that I could observe of her in the dim light and under the perplexingly strange circumstances of our meeting. What sort of woman she was, and how she came to be out alone in the high road, an hour after midnight, I altogether failed to guess. The one thing of which I felt certain was that the grossest of mankind could not have misconstrued her motive in speaking, even at that suspiciously late hour and in that suspiciously lonely place. "Did you hear me?" she said, still quietly and rapidly, and without the least fretfulness or impatience. "I asked if that was the way to London." "Yes," I replied, "that is the way. It leads to St. John's Woods and the Regent's Park. You must excuse my not answering you before. I was rather startled by your sudden appearance in the road, and I am, even now, quite unable to account for it." "You don't suspect me doing anything wrong, do you?" "I have done nothing wrong. I've met with an accident. I'm very unfortunate in being here alone so late. Why do you suspect me of doing wrong?" She spoke with unnecessary earnestness and agitation, and shrank back from me several paces. I did my best to reassure her. "Pray don't suppose that I have any idea of suspecting you," I said, "or any other wish than to be of assistance to you if I can. I only wondered at your appearance to the road, because it seemed to me to be empty the instant before I saw you." She turned and pointed back to a place at the junction of the road to London and the road to Hampstead, where there was a gap in the hedge. "I heard you coming," she said, "and hid there to see what sort of man you were before I risked speaking. I doubted and feared about it until you passed, and then I was obliged to steal after you and touch you." Steal after me and touch me? Why not call to me? Strange, to say the least of it. "May I trust you?" she asked. "You don't think the worse of me because I have met with an accident?" She stopped in confusion, shifted her bag from one hand to the other, and sighed bitterly. The loneliness and helplessness of the woman touched me. The natural impulse to assist her and to spare her got the better of the judgment, the caution, the worldly tact, which an older, wiser, and colder man might have summoned to help him in this strange emergency. "You may trust me for any harmless purpose," I said. "If it troubles you to explain your strange situation to me, don't think of returning to the subject again. I have no right to ask you for any explanations. Tell me how I can help you, and if I can, I will." "You are very kind, and I am very, very thankful to have met you." The first touch of womanly tenderness that I had heard from her trembled in her voice as she said the words, but no tears glistened in those large, wistfully attentive eyes of hers, which were still fixed on me. "I have only been in London once before," she went on, more and more rapidly, "and I know nothing about that side of it yonder. Can I get a fly or a carriage of any kind? Is it too late? I don't know. If you could show me where to get a fly, and if you will only promise not to interfere with me and to let me leave you when and how I please, I have a friend in London who will be glad to receive me. I want nothing else. Will you promise?" She looked anxiously up and down the road, shifted her bag again from one hand to the other, repeated the words, "Will you promise?" and looked hard in my face with a pleading fear and confusion that it troubled me to see. What could I do? Here was a stranger utterly and helplessly at my mercy, and that stranger was a forlorn woman. No house was near, no one was passing whom I could consult, and no earthly right existed on my part to give me power of control over her, even if I had known how to exercise it. I trace these lines, self-distressfully, with the shadows of after events darkening the very paper I write on, and still I say, what could I do? What I did do was to try and gain time by questioning her. "Are you sure that your friend in London will receive you at such a late hour as this?" I said. "Oh, quite sure. Only say that you will let me leave you when and how I please. Only say that you won't interfere with me. Will you promise?" As she repeated the words for the third time, She came close to me and laid her hand with sudden gentle stealthiness on my bosom. A thin hand, cold hand when I removed it with mine, even on that sultry night. Remember that I was young. Remember that the hand which touched me was a woman's. Will you promise? Yes. One word, the little familiar word that is on everybody's lips every hour in the day. Oh me, and I tremble now when I write it. We set our faces toward London and walked on together in the first still hour of the new day. I and this woman, whose name, whose character, whose story, whose objects in life, whose very presence by my side at that moment were fathomless mysteries to me. It was like a dream. Was I Walter Hartright? Was this the well-known, uneventful road where holiday people strolled on Sundays? Had I really left, little more than an hour since, the quiet, decent, conventionally domestic atmosphere of my mother's cottage? I was too bewildered, too conscious also of a vague sense of something like self-reproach, to speak to my strange companion for some minutes. It was her voice again that broke the silence between us. I want to ask you something, she said suddenly. Do you know many people in London? Yes, a great many. Many men of rank and title? There was an unmistakable tone of suspicion in the strange question, and I hesitated before answering it. Some, I said after a moment's silence. Many, she came to a full stop and looked me searchingly in the face. Many men of the rank of baronet? Too much astonished to reply, I questioned her in my turn. Why do you ask? Because I hope, for my own sake, there is one baronet that you don't know. Will you tell me his name? I can't. I daren't. I forget myself when I mention it. She spoke loudly and almost fiercely, and raised her clenched hand in the air and shook it passionately. Then on a sudden, controlled herself again and added, in tones lowered to a whisper, Tell me, which one of them you know? I could hardly refuse to humor her in such a trifle. I mentioned 3 names. 2, the names of fathers of families whose daughters I taught. 1, the name of a bachelor who had once taken me a cruise in his yacht to make sketches for him. Ah, you don't know him, she said with a sigh of relief. Are you a man of rank and title yourself? Far from it. I am only a drawing master. As the reply passed my lips, a little bitterly perhaps, she took my arm with the abruptness which characterized all her actions. Not a man of rank and title, she repeated to herself. Thank God, I may trust him. I had hitherto contrived to master my curiosity out of consideration for my companion, but it got the better of me now. I am afraid you have a serious reason to complain of some man of rank and title, I said. I am afraid the baronet, whose name you are unwilling to mention to me, has done you some grievous wrong? Is he the cause of your being out here at this strange time of night? Don't ask me. Don't make me talk of it, she answered. I'm not fit now. I've been cruelly used and cruelly wronged. You'll be kinder than ever if you will walk on fast and not speak to me. I sadly want to quiet myself if I can. We moved forward again at a quick pace, and for half an hour, at least, not a word passed on either side. From time to time, being forbidden to make any more inquiries, I stole a look at her face. It was always the same, the lips closed shut, the brow frowning, the eyes looking straight forward, eagerly, but absently. We had reached the first houses, and were close on the new Wesleyan College, before her set features relaxed, and she spoke once more. Do you live in London? She said. Yes. As I answered, it struck me that she might have formed some intention of appealing to me for assistance or advice, and that I ought to spare her a possible disappointment by warning her of my approaching absence from home. So I added, "But tomorrow I shall be away from London for some time. I'm going into the country." "Where?" she asked. "North or south?" "North, to Cumberland." "Cumberland," she repeated the word tenderly. I wish I was going there too. I was once happy in Cumberland. I tried again to lift the veil that hung between this woman and me. "Perhaps you were born," I said, "in the beautiful lake country." "No," she answered. "I was born in Hampshire, but I once went to school for a little while in Cumberland." "Lakes? I don't remember any lakes. It's Limmeridge Village and Limmeridge House I should like to see again." It was my turn now to stop suddenly. In the excited state of my curiosity at that moment, the chance reference to Mr. Fairley's place of residence on the lips of my strange companion staggered me to astonishment. "Did you hear anybody calling after us?" she asked, looking up and down the road affrightedly the instant I stopped. No, I was only struck by the name of Limmeridge House. I heard it mentioned by some Cumberland people a few days since." "Ah, not my people. Mrs. Fairley is dead, and her husband is dead, and their little girl may be buried now and gone away by this time. I can't say who lives at Limmeridge now. If any more are left there of that name, I only know I love them for Mrs. Fairley's sake." She seemed about to say more, but while she was speaking, we came within view of the turnpike, at the top of the Avenue Road. Her hand tightened round my arm, and she looked anxiously at the gate before us. "Is the turnpike man looking out?" she asked. He was not looking out. No one else was near the place when we passed through the gate. The sight of the gas lamps and houses seemed to agitate her and to make her impatient. "This is London," she said. "Do you see any carriage I can get? I'm tired and frightened. I want to set myself in and be driven away." I explained to her that we must walk a little further to get a cab stand, unless we were fortunate enough to meet with an empty vehicle, and then tried to resume the subject of Cumberland. It was useless. The idea of shutting herself in and being driven away had now got full possession of her mind. She could think and talk of nothing else. We had hardly proceeded a third of the way down the Avenue Road when I saw a cab draw up at a house a few doors below us, on the opposite side of the way. A gentleman got out and let himself in at the garden door. I hailed the cab as the driver mounted the box again, and when we crossed the road, my companion's impatience increased to such an extent that she almost forced me to run. "It's so late," she said. "I'm only in a hurry because it's so late." "I can take you, sir, if you're not going towards Tottenham Court Road," said the driver civilly when I opened the cab door. "My horse is dead beat, and I can't get him no further than the stable." Yes, that will do for me. I'm going that way. She spoke with breathless eagerness and pressed by me into the cab. I had assured myself the man was sober as well as civil before I let her enter the vehicle. And now, when she was seated inside, I entreated her to let me see her set down safely at her destination. No, she said vehemently. "I'm quite safe and quite happy now. If you are a gentleman, remember your promise. Let him drive on till I stop him. Thank you. My hand was on the cab door. She caught it in hers, kissed it, and pushed it away. The cab drove off at the same moment. I started into the road with some vague idea of stopping it again. I hardly knew why. Hesitated from the dread of frightening and distressing her. Called at last, but not loudly enough to attract the driver's attention. The sound of the wheels grew fainter in the distance. The cab melted into the black shadows on the road, and the woman in white was gone. minutes or more had passed. I was still on the same side of the way, now mechanically walking forward a few paces, now stopping again absently. At one moment, I found myself doubting the reality of my own adventure. At another, I was perplexed and distressed by an uneasy sense of having done wrong, which yet left me confusedly ignorant of how I could have done right. I hardly knew where I was going or what I was meant to do next. I was conscious of nothing but the confusion of my own thoughts, when I abruptly recalled to myself, awakened, I might almost say, by the sound of rapidly approaching wheels close behind me. I was on the dark side of the road, in the thick shadow of some garden trees, when I stopped to look round. On the opposite and lighter side of the way, a short distance below me, a policeman was strolling along in the direction of the Regent's Park. The carriage passed me, an open chaise, driven by two men. "Stop!" cried one. "There's a policeman. Let's ask him." The horse was instantly pulled up, a few yards beyond the dark place where I stood. "Policeman," cried the first speaker, "have you seen a woman pass this way?" "What sort of woman, sir?" "A woman in a lavender-colored gown." No, interposed the second man. "The clothes we gave her were found on her bed. She must have gone away in the clothes she wore when she came to us." "In white, policeman. A woman in white." "I haven't seen her, sir." "If you or any of your men meet up with a woman, stop her and send her in careful keeping to that address. I'll pay all expenses and a fair reward into the bargain." The policeman looked at the card that was handed down to him. "Why are we to stop her, sir? What has she done?" "Done? She has escaped from my asylum. Don't forget, a woman in white. Drive on." "She has escaped from my asylum." I cannot say with truth that the terrible inference which those words suggested flashed upon me like a new revelation. Some of the strange questions put to me by the woman in white, after my ill-considered promise to leave her free to act as she pleased, had suggested the conclusion either that she was naturally flighty and unsettled, or that some recent shock of terror had disturbed the balance of her faculties. But the idea of absolute insanity, which we all associate with the very name of an asylum, had, I can honestly declare, never occurred to me in connection with her. I had seen nothing in her language or her actions to justify it at that time, and, even with the new light thrown on her by the words which the stranger had addressed to the policeman, I could see nothing to justify it now. What had I done? Assisted the victim of the most horrible of all false imprisonments to escape, or cast loose on the wide world of London an unfortunate creature whose actions it was my duty, and every man's duty, mercifully to control? I turned sick at heart when the question occurred to me, and when I felt self-reproachfully that it was asked much too late. In the disturbed state of my mind, it was useless to think of going to bed. When I at last got back to my chambers in Clement's Inn, before many hours elapsed, it would be necessary to start on my journey to Cumberland. I sat down and tried, first to sketch, then to read, but the woman in white got between me and my pencil, between me and my book. Had the forlorn creature come to any harm? That was my first thought, though I shrank selfishly from confronting it. Other thoughts followed, on which it was less harrowing to dwell. Where had she stopped the cab? What had become of her now? Had she been traced and captured by the men in the chaise? Or was she still capable of controlling her own actions, and were we two following our widely parted roads toward one point in the mysterious future at which we were to meet once more? It was relief when the hour came to lock my door, to bid farewell to London pursuits, London pupils, and London friends, and to be in movement again towards new interests and a new life. Even the bustle and confusion at the railway terminus, so wearisome and bewildering at other times, roused me and did me good. My traveling instructions directed me to go to Carlisle, and then to diverge by a branch railway which ran in the direction of the coast. As a misfortune to begin with, our engine broke down between Lancaster and Carlisle. The delay occasioned by this accident caused me to be too late for the branch train, by which I was to have gone on immediately. I had to wait some hours, and when a later train finally deposited me at the nearest station to Limmeridge House, it was past 10, and the night was so dark that I could hardly see my way to the pony chaise, which Mr. Fairley had ordered to be in waiting for me. The driver was evidently discomposed by the lateness of my arrival. He was in a state of highly respectful sulkiness, which is peculiar to English servants. We drove away slowly through the darkness in perfect silence. The roads were bad, and the dense obscurity of the night increased the difficulty of getting over the ground quickly. It was, by my watch, nearly an hour and a half from the time of our leaving the station before I heard the sound of the sea in the distance and the crunch of our wheels on a smooth gravel drive. We had passed one gate before entering the drive, and we passed another before we drew up at the house. I was received by a solemn manservant out of livery, was informed that the family had retired for the night, and was then led to a large and lofty room where my supper was awaiting me, in a forlorn manner, at one extremity of a lonesome mahogany wilderness of a dining table. I was too tired and out of spirits to eat or drink much, especially with the solemn servant waiting on me as elaborately as if a small dinner party had arrived at the house instead of a solitary man. In a quarter of an hour, I was ready to be taken up to my bedchamber. The solemn servant conducted me to a pretty furnished room, said, "Breakfast at 9 o'clock, sir," looked all around him to see that everything was in its proper place, and noiselessly withdrew. What shall I see in my dreams tonight? I thought to myself as I put out the candle. The woman in white, or the unknown inhabitants of this Cumberland mansion? It was a strange sensation to be sleeping in the house, like a friend of the family, and yet not know one of the inmates even by sight. One moment. I am just taking a break to drink. Okay, onward. When I rose the next morning and drew up my blind, the sea opened before me joyously under the broad August sunlight, and the distant coast of Scotland fringed the horizon with its lines of melting blue. The view was such a surprise and such a change to me after my weary London experience of brick-and-mortar landscape that I seemed to burst into a new life and a new set of thoughts the moment I looked at it. A confused sensation of having suddenly lost my familiarity with the past, without acquiring any additional clearness of an idea in reference to the present or the future, took possession of my mind. Circumstances that were but a few days old faded back into my memory as if they had happened months and months since. Pesca's quaint announcement of the means by which he had procured me my present employment, the farewell evening I had passed with my mother and sister, even my mysterious adventure on the way home from Hampstead, had all become like events which might have occurred at some former epoch of my existence. Although the woman in white was still in my mind, the image of her seemed to have grown dull and faint already. A little before 9 o'clock, I descended to the ground floor of the house. The solemn manservant of the night before met me wandering amongst the passages and compassionately showed me the way to the breakfast room. My first glance round me, as the man opened the door, disclosed a well-furnished breakfast table standing in the middle of a long room with many windows in it. I looked from the table to the window furthest from me and saw a lady standing at it with her back turned towards me. The instant my eyes rested on her, I was struck by the rare beauty of her form and by the unaffected grace of her attitude. Her figure was tall, yet not too tall, comely and well developed, yet not fat, her head set on her shoulders with an easy, pliant firmness. Her waist, perfection in the eyes of a man, for it occupied its natural place. It filled out its natural circle. It was visibly and delightfully undeformed by stays. She had not heard my entrance into the room, and I allowed myself the luxury of admiring her for a few moments before I moved one of the chairs near me as the least embarrassing means of attracting her attention. She turned towards me immediately. The easy elegance of every movement of her limbs and body, as soon as she began to advance from the far end of the room, set me into a flutter of expectation to see her face clearly. She left the window, and I said to myself, "The lady is dark." She moved forward a few steps, and I said to myself, "The lady is young." As she approached nearer, and I said to myself, with a sense of surprise which words fail me to express, "The lady is ugly." Never was the old conventional maxim that nature cannot err more flatly contradicted. Never was the fair promise of a lovely figure more strangely and startlingly belied by the face and head that crowned it. The lady's complexion was almost swarthy, and the dark down on her upper lip was almost a mustache. She had a large, firm, masculine mouth and jaw, prominent, piercing, resolute brown eyes, and thick, coal black hair growing unusually down on her forehead. Her expression, bright, frank, and intelligent, appeared while she was silent to be altogether wanting in those feminine attractions of gentleness and pliability, without which the beauty of the handsomest woman alive is beauty incomplete. To see such a face as this, set on shoulders that a sculpture would have longed to model, to be charmed by the modest grace of action through which the symmetrical limbs betrayed their beauty when they moved, and then to be almost repelled by the masculine form and masculine look of the features in which the perfectly shaped figure ended, was to feel a sensation oddly akin to the helpless discomfort familiar to us all in sleep, where we recognize, yet can't reconcile the anomalies and contradictions of a dream. "Mr. Hartright," said the lady, interrogatively, her dark face lighting up with a smile and softening, growing womanly in the moment she began to speak. "We resigned all hope of you last night, and went to bed as usual. Accept my apologies for our apparent want of attention, and allow me to introduce myself as one of your pupils. Shall we shake hands? I suppose we must come to it sooner or later, and why not sooner?" These odd words of welcome were spoken in a clear, ringing, pleasant voice. The offered hand, rather large but beautifully formed, was given to me with the easy, unaffected self-reliance of a highly bred woman. We sat down together at the breakfast table in as cordial and customary a manner as if we had known each other for years, and had met at Limmeridge House to talk over old times by previous appointment. "I hope you come here good-humoredly, determined to make the best of your position," continued the lady. "You'll have to begin this morning by putting up with no other company at breakfast than mine. My sister is in her own room, nursing that essentially feminine malady, a slight headache, and her old governess, Mrs. Vesey, is charitably attending to her with restorative tea. My uncle, Mr. Fairley, never joins us at any of his meals. He is an invalid and keeps bachelor state in his own apartments. There's nobody else in the house but me. 2 young ladies have been staying here, but they went away yesterday in despair, and no wonder. All through their visit, in consequence of Mr. Fairley's invalid position, we produce no such convenience in the house as a flirtable, danceable, small-talkable creature of the male sex, And the consequence was we did nothing but quarrel, especially at dinner time. How can you expect 4 women to dine together alone every day and not quarrel? We are such fools, we cannot entertain each other at table. You see, I don't think much of my own sex, Mr. Hartright. Which will you have, tea or coffee? No woman does think much of her own sex, although few of them confess it as freely as I do. Dear me, you look puzzled. Why? Are you wondering what you will have for breakfast? Or are you surprised at my careless way of talking? In the first case, I advise you as a friend to have nothing to do with that cold ham at your elbow, and to wait till the omelet comes in. In the second case, I will give you some tea to compose your spirits, and do all a woman can, which is very little by the by, to hold my tongue. She handed me my cup of tea, laughing gaily. Her light flow of talk and her lively familiarity of manner with a total stranger were accompanied by unaffected naturalness and easy, inborn confidence in herself and her position, which would have secured her the respect of the most audacious man breathing. While it was impossible to be formal and reserved in her company, it was more than impossible to take the faintest vestige of a liberty with her, even in thought. I felt this instinctively, even while I caught the infection of her own bright gaiety of spirits, even while I did my best to answer her in her own frank and lively way. Yes, she said, when I had suggested the only explanation I could offer to account for my perplexed looks. I understand. You're such a perfect stranger in the house that you are puzzled by my familiar references to the worthy inhabitants. Natural enough. I ought to have thought of it before. At any rate, I can set it right now. Suppose I begin with myself, so as to get done with that part of the subject as soon as possible. My name is Marian Holcomb, and I am as inaccurate as women usually are in calling Mr. Farley my uncle, and Miss Fairley my sister. My mother was twice married, the first time to Mr. Holcomb, my father, and the second time to Mr. Fairley, my half-sister's father. Except that we are both orphans, and in every respect as unlike each other as possible. My father was a poor man, and Mrs. Fairley's father was a rich man. I've got nothing, and she has a fortune. I'm dark and ugly, and she is fair and pretty. Everybody thinks me crabbed and odd, with perfect justice, and everybody thinks her sweet-tempered and charming, with more justice still. In short, she is an angel, and I am... Oh, try some of that marmalade, Mr. Hartright, and finish the sentence in the name of female propriety for yourself. What am I to tell you about Mr. Fairley? Upon my honor, I hardly know. He is sure to send for you after breakfast, and you can study him for yourself. In the meantime, I may inform you first that he is the late Mr. Fairley's younger brother. Secondly, that he is a single man, and thirdly, that he is Miss Fairley's guardian. I won't live without her, and she can't live without me, and that is how I come to be at Limridge House. My sister and I are honestly fond of each other, which you will say is perfectly accountable under the circumstances, and I quite agree with you, but so it is. You must please both of us, Mr. Hartright, or please neither of us. And what is still more trying, you will be thrown entirely upon our society. Mrs. Vesey is an excellent person who possesses all the cardinal virtues and counts for nothing. And Mr. Fairley is too great an invalid to be a companion for anybody. I don't know what is the matter with him, and the doctors don't know what is the matter with him, and he doesn't know himself what is the matter with him. We all say it's on the nerves, and we none of us know what we mean when we say it. However, I advise you to humor his little peculiarities when you see him day to day. Admire his collection of coins and prints and watercolor drawings, and you'll win his heart. Upon my word, if you can be contented with a quiet country life, I don't see why you should not get on very well here. From breakfast till lunch, Mr. Fairley's drawings will occupy you. After lunch, Miss Fairley and I shoulder our sketchbooks and go out to misrepresent nature under your directions. Drawing is her favorite whim, mind, not mine. Women can't draw. Their minds are too flighty and their eyes are too inattentive. No matter, my sister likes it, so I waste paint and spoil paper for her sake as composedly as any woman in England. As for the evenings, I think we can help you through them. Miss Fairley plays delightfully. For my own poor part, I don't know one note of music from the other, but I can match you at chess, backgammon, écarté, and, with the inevitable female drawbacks, even at billiards as well. What do you think of the program? Can you reconcile yourself to our quiet, regular life, or do you mean to be restless and secretly thirst for change and adventure in the humdrum atmosphere of Limerick House? She had run on this far in her gracefully bantering way with no other interruptions on my part than the unimportant replies which politeness required of me. The turn of the expression, however, in her last question, or rather the one chance word, adventure, lightly as it fell from her lips, recalled my thoughts to my meeting with the woman in white, and urged me to discover the connection which the stranger's own reference to Mrs. Fairley informed me must once have existed between the nameless fugitive from the asylum and the former mistress of Limerick House. Even if I were the most restless of mankind, I said, I should be in no danger of thirsting after adventures for some time to come. The very night before I arrived at this house, I met with an adventure, and the wonder and excitement of it, I can assure you, Mrs. Halcombe, will last me for the whole term of my stay in Cumberland, if not for a much longer period. You don't say so, Mr. Hartright. May I hear it? You have a claim to hear it. The chief person in the adventure was a total stranger to me, and may perhaps be a total stranger to you, but she certainly mentioned the name of the late Mrs. Fairley in terms of the sincerest gratitude and regard. Mentioned my mother's name? You interest me indescribably. Pray go on. I at once related the circumstances under which I had met the woman in white, exactly as they had occurred, and I repeated what she had said to me about Mrs. Fairley and Limerick House, word for word. Miss Halcombe's bright, resolute eyes looked eagerly into mine from the beginning of the narrative to the end. Her face expressed vivid interest and astonishment, but nothing more. She was evidently as far from knowing of any clue to the mystery as I was myself. Are you quite sure of those words referring to my mother? She asked. Quite sure, I replied. Whoever she may be, the woman was once at school in the village of Limerick, and was treated with especial kindness by Mrs. Fairley, and in grateful remembrance of that kindness, feels an affectionate interest in all surviving members of the family. She knew that Mrs. Fairley and her husband were both dead, and she spoke of Miss Fairley as if they had known each other when they were children. You said, I think, that she denied belonging to this place. Yes, she told me that she came from Hampshire. And you entirely failed to find out her name? Oops. Sorry, the camera just tipped. Very strange. I think you were quite justified, Mr. Hartright, in giving the poor creature her liberty, for she seems to have done nothing in your presence to show herself unfit to enjoy it. But I wish you had been a little more resolute in finding out her name. We must really clear up this mystery in some way. You'd better not speak of it yet to Mr. Fairley or to my sister. They are, both of them, I am certain, quite as ignorant of who the woman is, and of what her past history in connection with us can be, as I am myself. But they are also, in widely different ways, rather nervous and sensitive, and you would only fidget one and alarm the other to no purpose. As for myself, I am all aflame with curiosity, and I devote my whole energies to the business of discovery from this moment. When my mother came here after her second marriage, she certainly established the village school, and just as it exists in the present time, but the old teachers are all dead or gone elsewhere, and no enlightenment is to be hoped for from that quarter. The only other alternative I can think of At this point, we were interrupted by the entrance of the servant with a message from Mr. Fairley, intimating that he would be glad to see me as soon as I had done breakfast. "Wait in the hall," said Miss Halcombe, answering the servant for me in her quick, ready way. "Mr. Hartright will come out directly." "I was about to say," she went on, addressing me again, "that my sister and I have a large collection of my mother's letters addressed to my father and to hers. In the absence of any other means of getting information, I will pass the morning looking over my mother's correspondence with Mr. Fairley. He was fond of London and was constantly away from his country home, and she was accustomed at such times to write and report to him how things went on in Limeridge. Her letters are full of references to the school in which she took so strong an interest, and I think it more likely that I may have discovered something when we meet again. The luncheon hour is 2, Mr. Hartright. I shall have the pleasure of introducing you to my sister by that time, and we will occupy the afternoon in driving around the neighborhood and showing you all of our pet points of view. Till 2 o'clock, then. Farewell." She nodded to me with the lively grace, the delightful refinement of familiarity which characterized all that she did and all that she said, and disappeared by a door at the lower end of the room. As soon as she had left me, I turned my steps toward the hall and followed the servant on my way for the first time to the presence of Mr. Fairley. Okay. Now, I'm not sure. What time is it? Okay, so I feel like we're at a good point to end for tonight, and we can pick up next week, same time, Wednesday at 8 o'clock Central Time, and we will meet Mr. Fairley and see what's going on. I'll do a little recap of what's happened so far before I start reading them, but I hope everyone enjoyed things. I hope it went well for everyone. I'm sorry again about the kind of ad hoc setup, but I went out of town, so I had to kind of improvise. All right, and thank you so much, everyone, and Vagrant Yeti Gaming. That is really sweet of you to say too. So thank you both very, very much. All right, night, everyone.